Tensions between Russia and the West are growing rapidly.
President Biden considering deploying thousands of troops to Eastern Europe.
The West wants to make Russia pay for its aggression, transgressions, and its invasion of Ukraine. The strategy is economic warfare. Back in February, the United States joined hands with like-minded nations in the world to put unprecedented sanctions on Russia. Since the beginning of the war, Russia has been hit with more than 11,000 coordinated sanctions. Economic experts agree that Russia is wounded, but despite the embargo, Putin's aggression only escalates. Ukraine remains under siege, and the economic sanctions are bleeding many unintended victims. So, 7 months later, you have to ask, have the sanctions failed? Who will pay the real cost of a raging war? And what more can be done to stop Russia? Just weeks after smacking Russia with the biggest sanctions regime in history, President Joe Biden claimed that the measures were causing the Russian economy to crater, and that's exactly what happened. For a brief moment, the Russian ruble tanked against the dollar. Multinational companies deserted Russia in numbers, and the country's economic outlook nosedived. An economic winter was predicted with hopes that the Russian economy will shrink by more than 15%. However, Russia responded with executive controls, and its economy proved more resilient than anticipated. The ruble's initial rapid depreciation was reversed. After Russia limited currency transactions, further help came as an unintended consequence of the sanctions. Since Russia wasn't allowed to import anything, the ruble kept on gaining strength. Now, it is officially the strongest performing currency of the year and is even stronger than it was before the sanctions. A fortified currency isn't always an indicator of a functioning economy, but other markers show why the Russian collapse hasn't happened at the pace it was predicted. Unemployment hasn't shown a noticeable surge, and 7 months later, Moscow's restaurants and bars remain busy as ever, and grocery shelves are stocked. Shopping malls are filled with people. The International Monetary Fund has revisited its initial gloomy forecast and now thinks that the Russian economy will contract by just over 4%. Yes, it's a massive fall, but much better than what was intended. The answer to whether the sanctions work or not is certainly subjective. However, the one indicator of failure is that even after months of sanctions, Russia is keeping the war going. What the West really wanted was to take away Moscow's ability to finance the war. However, Putin remains dedicated to his war and even announced the annexation of Donetsk, an area that makes up 18% of Ukraine's total land and is home to 6 million people. Even the early passionate Ukraine supporters and backers are not as confident as now. Elon Musk, for example, recently invited a Twitter war over his controversial comments urging Ukraine to be neutral and suggesting that they should let Russia have the annexed territories. But how is Russia sponsoring the war and defying the worst sanctions in history? For one, Russia has found substitutes to earn billions of dollars every month from oil and gas exports, turning away from Europe. Moscow has diversified its customer base and is exporting more oil to China and to India. The Russians are offering a 30% discount to any takers, and there are many interested parties, even Saudi Arabia. The largest oil producer in the world is now buying Russian crude at a discount for its power plants, while freeing up its own resources to sell to other countries. But there's an even bigger problem with the sanctions regime. European countries have failed to find a substitute for their dependence on Russian gas. Any embargoes on gas imports will only come into effect next year, which means the European Union is not in a position to damage the Russian economy too much. While Russia remains starved of much of its global trade, oil and gas exports have shot up. Add to that the benefits of rising commodity prices, and Russia has taken in close to $200 billion through the sales of fossil fuels. To sum the situation up, Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas meant that the sanctions were not comprehensive enough, and many in the United States overestimated and overstated their impact. While Russia sits on a war chest, the sanctions also remain a reality. They haven't yet made a dent in Putin's strategic calculations, but millions are suffering the consequences. Europe pays the price. The current wave of sanctions is different from any collective effort of the past. When Western nations took such measures on countries like Iran and North Korea, their own economies remained safe from any blowback. But the problem with Russia is that Europe needs its fossil fuels, and sanctioning Russia always meant there would be a retaliation. While Europe blacklisted Russia, it gave Putin the license to freeze Europe. The Kremlin's first measure was to slash 80% of the supply from the Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline. In all, Russia will cut 75% of its gas exports to Europe, and with winter approaching, governments are scrambling for alternatives. That is far from a straightforward task because in 2021, Russia supplied half of Europe's gas imports. In anticipation of the coming shortages, gas prices have soared to historic highs, and even though Russia supplies much less than before, it is making a bigger profit. Consumers in Britain now face the prospect of a 200% increase in their gas bills, while Germany is figuring out ways to combat the 3% decline in GDP after a ban on Russian imports. The political opposition in France is getting louder, and its leaders have labeled the sanctions ineffective for the president of the far-right party. The sanctions serve no purpose except to make the people of Europe suffer. Europe is plunging fast into an energy crisis, and the upcoming winter will only serve to make the crisis worse. And then there's Ukraine. According to the World Bank, Ukraine's economy will shrink 8 times more than that of Russia. Ukraine will see a 35% contraction in its GDP compared to just 4.5% for Russia. Even if the war ends by the end of the year, the recovery would be slow, and the cost to rebuild would be a massive $350 billion, almost twice the size of Ukraine's pre-war GDP. It's not just Europe. The whole world is looking at an energy crisis. With chaotic supply chains, everything is inflated and millions are on the verge of starvation. But there is a silver lining. Despite the hard times, Europe seems to have doubled down on its position to ban Russia. Sooner or later, it's bound to make an impact. When will the sanctions work? Does this all mean that Russia will escape the consequences of the Ukraine offensive? The answer is no. The impact of Western measures has not been as swift as expected. However, the truth is that the Russian economy and society in general are under immense stress, and it will stay that way for a long time. Ever since the Russian invasion, thousands of highly educated people have fled the country. Hundreds of foreign companies have stopped operations, and Russia has lost access to the technical expertise of the West. The economy has mostly survived on oil, but the model is highly unsustainable. Moscow has defaulted on its foreign debt for the first time in a century, and experts believe that 15 years of economic growth will be erased after the sanctions. Russia has officially reported a federal budget deficit of 900 billion rubles, which is equal to 8% of the country's GDP. The only problem is that none of it is happening quickly enough. To make that happen, the European Union needs to cut Russia's oil and gas exports altogether. Restricted purchases are keeping Russia afloat while not doing enough for the European economy. But now, we know that Europe is not ready for such a radical step just now, and a collapse cannot be expected until next year. It should be understood that the picture is not all rosy for Russia.